of background on, I started doing research to build a presentation for this UMC this summer. And I started with the wiki, picked up some biographies, and eventually picked up some books with his mathematics and with the assistance of some of the PhD students here. I got through some of it, and I got my presentation together, and I went for a test run, and it took about an hour and 10 minutes for a 20-minute time slot. So that was obviously an issue. So I kind of revised my presentation. It's the one I ended up presenting at CUMC. So instead of like a full intact biography, it's kind of like a rough skeleton of some important aspects of Ramanujan's life, kind of like more anecdotal, some interesting anecdotes and things like that. And then I ended up with taking a look at some of his work in math. It's not quite as extensive as I would have liked. So, okay. So, early life, like with most people, he was born. Not too much happened for the earliest period of his life. He was born in the South Indian province of Tamil Nadu, and he moved around a few times early in life, and eventually ended up settling down in, I'm guessing it's pronounced CUMath&Stats, not exactly sure, in 1895. And so during his primary school years, there wasn't too many red flags that would have indicated that Ramanujan would grow up to be kind of the mathematical talent that he did. So there wasn't much notice, he kind of had an inclination to be doing more math work than the typical student, but nothing really big stood out. Basically until high school, and these were some of the kind of interesting signs start showing. So by second form, which is kind of like intermediate school over here, he starts displaying talent that's picked up by some of his peers and his students in his school, and the biographer goes back and interviews these guys, and they say that he was kind of seen, even at this early age, as a go-to person for if you're having problems with math homework or assignments, you can come to him and he'll help. And even helping students in higher grades than him, this was common. The next year, by third form, he's starting to even challenge his teachers in some ways. His teacher was going over just some properties of division and was mentioning any number divided by itself is going to be 1. Take 1,000 apples, divide it amongst 1,000 people, each person gets 1 apple. And it said that Ramanujan kind of piped up in the back, and he's like, well, if you take 0 apples and you divide it among 0 people, how many does each person get? Which, it's not that mind-blowing of a concept, but it shows, kind of interesting personality type. He's already starting to look at math in different ways than most of his peers. Here it kind of starts taking off. He starts familiarizing himself with important transcendental numbers like e and pi, and I guess he had a ferocious memory for just memorizing mathematical terms, and he was able to recite either one of these to countless decimal places effortlessly. So it was also around this time, during his time in intermediate school and high school, his parents took on some student boarders. So his family, to give you a bit of a background more, his family they weren't desperately poor, but they certainly weren't well off, and they thought it would be a good idea to supplement their income by just renting some of the rooms in their homes to some students attending college nearby. And Ramanujan had kind of exhausted all the math that was in arm's grasp in his high school, so he started inquiring about getting some college-level textbooks. And he got a few. One of them was famously a book on trigonometry, which kind of introduced him to some of his first glimpses into like higher-level mathematics and pure math. And towards the end of his high school career, he became like even more distant from his students and peers. And I just kind of handpicked an interesting quote from one of his students. So one of his peers rather, later recalled that we, including the teachers, rarely understood him. And I took the quote because not only did it reflect how kind of people around him thought at that age, it's kind of like a good foreshadowing to what his mathematical career would become, because even later in life he was kind of seen as an enigma. And I kind of complement this quote with another quote that was made by a Polish mathematician shortly after his death. So not the best at reading quotes, but give it a try. So an ordinary genius is a fellow you and I would be just as good as if only we were many times better. There's no mystery as how his mind works. Once we understood what he has done, we feel certain that we too could have done it. It is different with the magicians, referring to Ramanujan, of course. They are to use mathematical jargon in the orthogonal complement of where we are, and workings of their mind is for all intents and purposes incomprehensible. Even after we have understood what they have done, the process by which they have done it is completely dark. So again, it's kind of like with this same kind of theme that even when he eventually, later on, spoiler alert, he gets recognized and he starts making ground in the academic world, even peers in that sort of world are still kind of mystified as to how his brain works and how he approaches problems. So shortly after graduating from high school, he gets some scholarships to go to a local college. And it's also around this point in his life where he encounters a very influential book, had a big impact on his life and his mathematical career. So later, someone would comment that the book is not in any sense a good one, but Ramanujan has made it famous. And this was a synopsis of elementary results in pure and applied mathematics by Carr. And essentially what the book is like, it's kind of like an artist's parade of theorems and lemmas one after the other. And a really important aspect of the book is its lack of mathematical rigor. So often it would have maybe some accompanying notes of why a particular theorem might be true, but it certainly fell short of any type of proper rigorous proof, and sometimes there'd be nothing accompanying it at all. And it kind of had an impact in the way Ramanujan would write his work, because for a long time he's kind of working on his own. He's in high school, he's starting college, he's doing work independently. He's not sure how to structure formal proofs, so he kind of has these scraps of paper where he writes ideas that to him he thinks he's making grounds. They seem correct, and he doesn't really prove them. It's kind of a problem. In some cases, he actually ends up coming to conclusions that are false because of his lack of mathematical rigor, but that was kind of a rarity. Most of the time, he just had tremendous insight. He'd jump, 10 stages in a proof in one instance, and he'd just write the conclusion like that. There's a lot of interesting anecdotes about him doing that. So again, yeah, this had influence in him in two different ways. One, of course, was it kind of laid a blueprint for his style of his mathematical presentation, but also kind of finally catapults someone who's kind of like keenly interested in mathematics into like someone who's pretty much obsessed with mathematics. At this point, he's working, hours on end. It said that sometimes he'd stay up for days straight just working, and he'd be so intent on the problems that he would forget to eat and drink, and his mom would sometimes have to come to him and literally put food in his hand and kind of like put it towards his mouth to convince him to start eating, because he could just not take himself away from his papers. And not surprisingly, this had a devastating result on his academic career in college. He's trying to focus only on math. I'm not even sure if he was regularly attending the mathematics class in the college, and he starts failing his other classes, and he's in and out of college a few times, and he eventually drops out for good. And so it's kind of like a silver lining to the gray cloud in the sense that he was kind of torn between a lot of different pressures, his pursuit and love for mathematics, but also pressure from his family back at home, especially his mother, who wanted him to graduate from college, get a promising career, And when he dropped out of college for good, he's finally free to just pursue his mathematics, do what he loved to do. He wasn't well off. He made some money doing tutoring for students at the college that he had dropped out of. A lot of the students that he had didn't take too well to his tutoring, again, because his style was very bizarre. Like, for example, he'd often use n as a continuous variable, and for us, we often see it more as like a index for counting, or at least a discrete variable, and sometimes continuous, but rarely. But anyways, he had a lot of bizarre kind of just notation like that in general. And around this time, so he has this free time, he starts compiling papers about his work and theorems and collecting them, and this collection kind of later is referred to as his first notebook. And this period in his life continues for a while until his mom she's kind of discouraged about where his life is going. He's making a bit of money, definitely not a great living, and she kind of pressures him into this arranged marriage, and that kind of like, again, changes track for his life, and he kind of gets a different sort of set of goals. So he was able to draw himself away from his work, and he realized that he needs to set himself up so that he can support a family. So he enters this phase in his life where he's almost like a door-to-door salesman. So he has this collection of mathematical works, and he's going around to different colleges, universities, professors, pretty much anyone that will give him the time, and trying to make them see that he has worth in what he does. And both due to the sheer complicated nature of what he was working on and his sloppy style, again, he had trouble getting any groundwork. So I selected, he eventually does make some progress, some traction. People kind of recognize that he does have some sort of work. They can't really put their thumb on it, but he gets a problem published in the math journal, and it doesn't appear properly in the PDF, but I have it kind of online here. So it's just this interesting kind of set of nested radicals. If anyone wants to take a guess as to what this kind of converges to, feel free. Anyone? Well, some people know, I guess Stephen knows, but it converges to 3. So, I mean, to me it's pretty obvious. No, I'm joking. But what's more fascinating is that by the way, when he posted this problem, no one was able to write in the answer, and a few issues later, he just wrote the answer himself. But more interesting than that is it comes from a much more powerful general result, which he comes up with here. So it's kind of like, I threw it in because it's fascinating, it's bizarre, it was his first kind of real publication. And if we, I can't even remember off the top of my head, but I think if you take a to be 0 and x to be 2 and n to be 1, then you get 3, and you'll get the nested radicals on the previous page. So I'm going to be jumping between my PowerPoint and just online because just the way the slides work, so sorry about that. It doesn't appear here correctly, obviously. So shortly after he publishes this problem, he gets like a more proper academic paper published, and it's on some properties of Bernoulli numbers, and it's again in this same mathematical journal. And he's still kind of in this phase where he's traveling around trying to get recognition, and he starts taking his first notebook and he's trying to get a revised version that's more kind of thorough and properly articulates with the points he's trying to get across. But it's almost like he gets lost in his passion, and he just starts adding extra and more, and just sometimes just completely new theorems, and eventually it becomes what's sort of later referred to as his second notebook. And it doesn't really do much better at kind of clearly demonstrating what he's talking about anyways, which kind of defeats the purpose. And gets a bit more traction. He gets a clerkship at a port, and some of his superiors take a liking to him, and they kind of relieve him of some of his duties and give him time to just pursue his strange kind of goals. He's kind of looked more as like a bizarre guy that's kind of maybe passionate about cars and works on cars in his garage, as opposed to someone who's a professional mechanic or a professional mathematician who's working out of the university. And eventually, one of his friends pushes him to kind of search outside India for recognition, and he writes some letters to some professors at Trinity College, Cambridge. And the first 2 letters received no reply. The author of the biography is not even sure why they didn't receive a reply, but it's really likely to just his style and kind of his workings. But eventually he famously writes a letter to a professor, G.H Hardy at Cambridge, and it starts off with, I have to introduce myself. So anyone who's even moderately familiar with the Ramanujan story, you know, they've heard about how he finally is discovered by Hardy, so he takes a liking to him. His letter, he actually kind of strategically selects theorems of his that he knows Hardy will find interesting, because he's looking at Hardy's publications, and he knows kind of some of the areas that Hardy's working in. And Hardy's kind of, there's kind of a day where he's unsure about the letter, he's not sure what to make of it, but he confers with a colleague, and shortly after he's thoroughly convinced, you know, he's dumbstruck by the work, he's convinced that they're the workings of a genius, and he makes efforts to kind of bring Ramanujan to Cambridge. And so I highlighted some of the more interesting kind of mathematical expressions that were included in the letter. So if you bear with me, I'll just try to bring those up. Again, I'm just kind of jumping around here. So we have this kind of repeated fraction here, and you know, I'm not too sure what to make of it. The first time I saw this, to be honest, when I'm doing research for my presentation, I'm almost kind of discouraged, because I'm like, yeah, that kind of looks nice. I don't have the faintest inclination of why it's true, why it's significant, what to make of it. It's kind of like, maybe this guy's just above my head. Maybe I shouldn't be doing a presentation. I've never seen anything like this. And then he has this one too. I'm getting nowhere more familiar with this sort of expression either. And then shortly after, I kind of read Hardy's kind of reflections on particularly these kind of expressions that appear later in his letter. And it's interesting because he's basically as dumbstruck as I was. So I might just stay with the Google instead of switching back and forth. But so this is Hardy's kind of comments on it. He's saying Ramanujan's theorems, mainly these last ones, defeated me completely. I had never seen anything in the least like them before. A single look at them is enough to show that they could only be written by a mathematician of the highest class. And then later adding, they must be true because if they were not, no one would have imagined to invent them. So like, it's a pretty powerful statement. Kind of, you can comically rephrase it as essentially saying you can't make this shit up. It's so strange and so bizarre that it must be true. So I mentioned previously that, oh yeah, really quick, this one was actually not included in the letter, but this one is just like one of my favorites. I tried to include as little from the Wikipedia articles. If you went to Wiki and later, you wouldn't find much in my presentation, but this one's on the Wiki. It's just too good not to include. It's just a very bizarre series that gives a convergence for pi, and both, it's just really strange, and it's actually very powerful. If you just let it iterate once, it's already pi to 6 decimal places, and it's one of the most rapidly converging series, and it's actually used as the foundations for most algorithms that calculate pi to this day. So I thought that was pretty interesting. So unfortunately, kind of caught between two different motivations. Like I mentioned, the presentation is actually really long, so what I'm actually going to do at this point is kind of skip ahead to just look at some of his mathematical works and diverge from the biography. If you guys want to know more about when he goes to Cambridge, and unfortunately he passes away at a very young age. He becomes sick when he's over there. He stays there for a few years, returns home, and he passes away at the age of 32. I can fill you in, but since this is a math colloquium, I thought we'd just take a look at some of the mathematics. So it's kind of bizarre to just skip his death, but so I just decided to take a look at one area really quickly. A lot of the work Ramanujan works in is in number theory. Does anyone have the time? I'm going over anything. 125. Looks good. So yeah, a lot of the work he does is in number theory. So I picked kind of a topic in number theory that was accessible to pretty much any undergraduate, and decided to have a little brief discussion. So Ramanujan at some point kind of decides he's going to come up with a definition for a number, that type of property that certain numbers have that he finds interesting. And he calls these highly composite numbers. And what a highly composite number is, so I'm sure everyone's familiar with primes and composite numbers, right? And he's calling these highly composite numbers, they're numbers that have more factors than any other, or more divisors than any other number that comes before it. So for some reason, he feels this is a particularly interesting property, and he's going to pursue it more, see if he can find things that are common to all highly composite numbers and whatnot. So right off the bat, there's kind of this property. If you're looking at the prime factorization of a highly composite number, and you're looking at the indices of the exponents of the primes, you're going to have this ordering. And that's actually really, really apparent if you think about it. And the reasoning is pretty much down to this. If you take a prime factorization and you start switching around the indices of exponents of different primes, you're not going to change how many factors it has. But you will change how big it is. If you're interested in a number that has more factors than any integer smaller than it, then you're going to want as much weight on the earlier primes, on the smaller primes, if that makes sense. So, in fact, he later goes on, it's a bit more of a difficult proof, but he later goes on to show that towards the end you'll actually have, towards the beginning rather, you'll have strict equalities, and at the end you can have some repeated where indices might be 1, 1, 1 for the largest 3 primes. Some other properties he investigates. Okay, so this is another interesting kind of property. This one's kind of much less apparent. I was looking at like his actual proof. It was edited by Hardy. for this property, and like I couldn't get anywhere with it. It would have taken me a while to go over it, and so I just threw it down here, and I'm not going to say it out loud. It's this expression right here, and essentially how you might want to interpret it is that highly composite numbers become more common in proportion to how large they are. So it's interesting in a lot of ways, because like a highly composite number in one way is kind of like as close to the opposite of a prime as you might like. And people are familiar with the concept that primes are becoming more kind of spread apart as you travel down the numbers. But these highly composite numbers aren't necessarily becoming closer together, but they are becoming closer together in ratio to how large they are. Much closer together. In fact, asymptotically close. Eventually the next one is just, one away. So then he goes on to look at something he defines. Again, this is all stuff he started pursuing, and he defines a new type of number, calling it a superior highly composite number. And he gives it this definition seen below. That's supposed to be a there exists, kind of new to PowerPoint, so I wasn't exactly sure how to write that properly. So I'm not entirely sure what motivated him to give a definition to this. It might kind of stick out as kind of a strange thing to pursue, but for some reason maybe it was occurring to him that these numbers are coming up a lot, or he might be able to gain some traction, and he later goes on to just kind of give a precise form to all superior highly composite numbers. And this proof, again, it's really difficult for an undergraduate to kind of navigate through, even with the assistance of some of the PhD students. I couldn't get through all of the proofs I wanted to, but that's that. And I'll end my presentation here. There was some work on partition congruencies and actually a proof that I had in my presentation, but just how the time's working out, I'll end it here. If you guys want to find out any other information, like I got, barrels full of interesting anecdotes about him. I got some books with his publications, and if you guys want to talk about it, let me know, and hope you enjoy the time.